Happy. Ah. Uh, um, let's start seated today. So just a nice comfy seat. Something that you feel like you can settle into. And once you are comfortable there, let's start to settle into the breath itself. So that there is an ease that just washes over you with each cycle of breath. Let each cycle of breath be an experience of tension and stress just releasing. So at the end of each exhale, you feel more grounded. Give ourselves about 60 more seconds here, just settling into the breath. And then eventually, as you feel right, let's allow the eyes to blink open. And as the eyes blink open, let's slide our hands behind us for a moment. So interlacing so that the palms are away from you and the backs of the hands are pressed against the back. So you create a connection there at the hands and potentially some pretty significant sensation of restriction at the shoulders. And all we're going to do is pull the shoulders back and keep the head so that it's creating more and more space. So it's theoretically possible, I think, that if the chin drops, there could be more space. For me, it's always going to be finding neutral or maybe even lifting the chin slightly, but really seek out what gives you the most shoulder space in the head position. And then we're going to release that and work our way to hands and knees tabletop. Now we're going to use that extra shoulder sensation to help us set our tabletop. So as you make your way here, middle of the body comes to neutral. So we want that abdominal engagement. And then I want you to think about squeezing the shoulder blades up towards the ceiling. So that pulls the torso down, but I want the subscapular musculature to be really active. And then we're going to sway the hips a little laterally. So we're trying to put the shoulders under some tension and keep that. So as the hips start to move, it starts to free up that subscapular musculature. I want you to keep engaging more deeply so that the shoulder stability musculature stays as active as possible as we sway the hips. And then eventually, either we'll no longer be able to create tension or we'll find our way back to neutral and then settle the hips back into child's pose. And here, let the shoulders deactivate so that there is a complete release of the shoulder tissue. And feel how that impacts the entirety of the posterior chain on the torso so that you have a relaxation of that backside torso musculature. And you settle into that release on the backside of the body. Fingertips rip into the mat. Let's pull our way forward, refinding tabletop. And from tabletop, set the middle of the body to neutral, then exhale out, get into your cat shape, big flexion articulation. And at the top of this shape, position the chin as firmly to the sternum or as close to the sternum as you can get it. And think about bowing out that space in between the scapula so that we're a little bit higher than we'd normally be. Normally, our focus is in the middle of the back. Here, we're going to look middle of the shoulders. And then release with an exhale. Belly drops, chin lifts, tailbone lifts. And here, think about bringing the extension lower into the shape as well. So middle of the lumbar would normally be our space. Think about going below the belly and a belly button and really getting a lift into that tailbone. Like the tailbone lift is the emphasis. And then we'll reverse with an inhale, chin tucks as firmly as can be. We're bowing out into the middle of the shoulder structure, really trying to focus our effort on the high and low end of this spinal articulation instead of the middle. And then exhale, belly drops, chin lifts, tailbone lifts. And so I'm going to turn over the movement to you. I'm really hoping that you spend some elongated time and some cycles of breath on each end. So inhales, we lift, we focus on the shoulders. Exhales, we drop, we focus on the tailbone, and we really find full articulation of the top and the bottom of the shape, or of these two shape cycles. And just moving at your own pace. Exhales, drop. Inhales, lift. Main emphasis. And we'll give ourselves about 45 more seconds. Actually, let's do 60 seconds. You have another minute just to explore this. Really feel free and comfortable to hang out in the corners of these two ends of the shape. And last 30 seconds here. Exploring through the possibility of movement of the spinal column. maybe your last cycle here. And eventually, when it feels right, we're all just going to work through neutral and back into child's pose again. And this time, as you settle, we're wanting the middle of the back to relax. So the middle of the back can join the space that we've created on the top and the bottom of the spinal column. Think about inflating the lungs right in the middle of the body so that that thoracic joint, the unionization of the thoracic and lumbar spine, receives the brunt of the breath expansion. And then as you exhale, just think about relaxing the musculature along the back as much as is possible. And let's give ourselves 15 more seconds here. And when you're right, fingertips gripping into the mat, we'll pull ourselves to hands and knees tabletop. Curl our toes. We're going to get one down dog in here. So toes curl, seat lifts. We ride that spinal column length back into the depth of the shape. Because we have extra mobility at the top and the bottom, it's very easy for the middle of the shape to get soft. Make sure you have core engagement so that we're keeping that anterior posterior neutrality as we lift back. Make sure we're not losing the sternum to a forward drop and in total torso anterior collapse, really. Really drive into that neutral length. And then let's walk our way forward to the front of the mat. Again, we won't be here long, just enough to settle into this standing forward fold. Inhale into half lift. Feeling the posterior musculature reactivate and reintegrate from the top to the bottom of the spinal column. And then exhale your way back down into your fold. Drift your awareness to your sacrum. Let's roll ourselves up nice and slow, using all of that extension energy through this lift. Eventually, the head comes to neutral. We'll bring our hands together at heart center, find our way into mountain. Keep that nice, neutral, anterior, posterior alignment. And then let's just take a little pigeon toe. So heels come out, toes stay in. It doesn't need to be this exaggerated, right? So you could have a more traditional alignment. And we're going to fold our way forward, thinking about the sacrum opening up on the way down. So you're getting some lateral space at the sacrum. This also does a really nice job of challenging the low hamstring insertion just above the knee. Inhale to half lift. Exhale back to fold. Plant your hands. We'll walk our way back into down dog. Come down to hands and knees. And let's slide our legs out in front of us for a brief little seated fold. I'm going to suggest knees pretty significantly bent, but you don't have to do that. If your forward fold feels best with the legs extended, wonderful. If we're just looking for a guide point, I'm going to say pretty significant bend. And let's take our torso forward until we feel somewhere along this torso chain getting some expansion. Whether it is in the lumbar, whether it's at that midpoint or in the thoracic spine, is less consequential than we're getting expansion. And so a long time ago, there was we'd probably know him as a pioneer or a settler. This old man had built what we might consider an off-grid cabin now, but it was just a cabin then because there was no grid to be off of. And he had taken up a unique and interesting position in the forest that he had chose to make his home in. He'd become kind of an animal herbalist. Last 30 seconds here. And when you're right, when you're ready, let's walk our spine back to vertical. And then let's lower ourselves onto our back. Just make sure you have access to your blanket before you make it all the way down here, so you can easily access the blanket or towel. And then we're going to settle. Legs can be extended, knees can be bent, bottoms of the feet can be together, although we are going to get into a Baddha Sukhasana later in practice. So just keep that in mind if you have limited time capacity in that shape. And here, really think about how the shoulder and hip girdles are meeting the mat. How that cat-cow work we did, flexion, extension, expression we did, has allowed for more space across the shoulder girdle and across the hip girdle. And think about bringing your breath so that the width of both the shoulders and the hips are able to fully potentiate. Each breath, this opportunity for the shoulders and the hips to just get a little bit more width to them, a little bit more release to them. And we'll give ourselves about 30 more seconds here. Breathing into and creating space. And when you're right, when you're ready, let's all bring our knees to a neutral position. So kneecaps point towards the ceiling. We'll grab our blanket or towel, and from a shelf fold position, we'll make a hot dog fold. So we end up with a relatively high density but low impact lift for a supported bridge. So we're going to slide this underneath the tailbone. And we're only looking for maybe 1 to 2 inches of lift here. We're not trying to create a lot of elevation. Really focus on the top edge of your prop being no higher than the top edge of your sacrum. So oftentimes our prop will glide up and get into the lumbar. Really think about getting below the lumbar here, and then allow the bottoms of the feet to come together and the knees fall out wide. And so we're working kind of two contrasting opening experiences. We're working the medial line on the anterior side. With this little lift and with the external rotation of the hips, we're also working some lateral expansion of the sacral joint. So as you breathe here, especially as you land into your exhale, continue that idea of width across the hip girdle. Hopefully the shoulders have relatively settled by now. And we're going to be here for about 30 more seconds. So while most of the frontiersmen, settlers of the early Americas were doing everything they could do to hunt and provide nutrition for themselves and their family. This particular settler had taken a very different approach. He had become the medic of the forest. And he spent his days wandering through these wooded areas of the Northeast, tending to and taking care of injured animals. Some animals maybe become injured just based upon their wild experience. Others might have fallen victim to hunters' traps. He certainly stayed busy. Over the course of time, he had found and befriended a raven. And this became a very good partnership for him. When you're ready, when you're right, let's bring our knees back to neutral. And we'll slide our blanket out from underneath us and let the hips come down, let the sacrum really settle. And let's take our left ankle across our right thigh. And so as we take this adjustment, note how the lateral edge of the hip feels. If you get here and you're instantaneously feeling a pretty good amount of lateral load, that hip flexor just doesn't want to work anymore, let's stay right here. If we feel like there's some openness, we can lift the right knee, the right heel maybe, that lifts the right knee, so that you have some additional support. And then if it's within the practice, you could slide the hands behind or around the right hamstring and draw even more energy into that left hip capsule. At the same time, and maybe luckily for us, we're likely still stuck with some extra sensation across the shoulder girdle from all that subscapular work we did at the start of class. If you feel that we're straining into the shoulders to get the hips to work, it likely means we've gone one step too far, and we can back up a step so that we are comfortable and relaxed in the shoulders as we're looking to work and expand the hips. No reason to cheat the shortness in the shoulders to try to extend hip space. And then eventually we're going to extend our right leg down the mat. And as the right leg extends, the left ankle is staying across that thigh and we're just opening. Now, for some of us, we're going to have a pretty good amount of quad sensation there, and it might feel like too much. You can use the blanket as is or unfolded to provide a little buffer between that physical sensation of compression of the left ankle and right quad, if that feels beneficial to you. And then we're looking for the left hip to relax with our breath cycles here. Thinking about how that left hip can just become more and more externally rotated through release. And so this frontiersman, this herbalist, this early herbalist, had quite a collection of herbal tonics, wound dressings, etc., that he would use on these wounded animals. But there were, of course, times in which he was unable, the animal was too injured for him to save. And this friendship with this raven allowed for a really easy place for unsavable animals to be utilized. Right? Anything that he didn't eat, if he couldn't save an animal and he tried everything he could, if he couldn't save an animal, he would sometimes consume them. And what he didn't consume, the raven always would. Just another breath cycle or two here, really trying to feel the hips relax as fully and completely as possible, especially the left hip. And then we'll extend the left leg down to mirror the right. Note the asymmetry or symmetry in the legs and try to bring yourself into more and more balance. And then eventually we're going to bend both knees. And let's take our right ankle across our left thigh. Note that your hips can have very different opening capacities. And so don't necessarily just go to the stage that was right on the left side. Make sure that the stage that you choose here is right for the right side. First option is exactly where we are. Second option is that little heel lift. And the third option is the hands wrapping behind the hamstring. All of these options are perfect. It's just the right one that matches your needs this morning. And then remember to check in with the shoulders and ensure that the shoulders are relaxed if you do have a leg grip. And we'll just relax and be at ease here, or as much ease as is possible. Maybe just another reminder to really think about the landing capacity in your exhale breath, so that at the end of each exhale, you truly feel like you are receiving the restorative benefit of being here on the mat and not fighting or holding tension, but creating space through that conscious release. Eventually, when you feel balanced left to right, we'll allow the left leg to extend. That right ankle stays on top of the thigh. Again, you can utilize the prop if it is helpful for you. You do have to compensate for the fact that there will be extra space, right? So it makes the hip opening a little bit more intense or challenging. We just breathe and land in our exhale breath. And so over the course of the years, this man has saved hundreds, if not thousands, of animals. And maybe a roughly equivalent number have been unsavable. But he has also picked up an apprentice. They built a second cabin. And with 4 hands, 2 bodies, they're able to cover more space and contact more animals, help more injured and wounded creatures. And they work fairly tirelessly to make this happen. All the while, the creatures that are not savable are either consumed by them or consumed by the raven. We'll give ourselves just 30 more seconds here on this second side. When you feel right, when you feel ready, let's extend that right leg to mirror the left. Feel into that space. And then take your heels out to the width of your hips. So like 4/5 distance apart, and bring your toes together. So wider leg space, toes coming together, internal rotation of the hips. And with the hips internally rotated, extend with your palms face up, your arms towards the space behind you. So backs of the hands are on the ground, elbows are lifted. So you have enough arm engagement that the elbows are lifted, palms up towards the ceiling, back of the hands to the ground, armpits hollowing out. And really think about drawing the expansion, not from the shoulder capsule, but into the back itself. And this can be upper, middle, or lower back, depending on what needs its space. And then we'll relax the feet, or relax the arms to cactus, and just settle for a moment. Not a long break here, just something to reintegrate. And we'll bend both knees. Grab, re-engage our blanket. And we're using this hot dog fold, so same shape we've had it in. And we're gonna lift our belt line up high enough to slide the blanket up underneath the shoulder blades. So that's a bad description, up to the bottom of the shoulder blades. So the blanket doesn't get underneath the shoulder blades, but it comes up to the edge of the shoulder blades, and then we release the tailbone back down. So we have a middle body extension. I am always overly cautious, likely overly cautious, but I always remind everyone this shape, while the mechanism of movement or the prop seems small, this is a pretty intense shape for the back musculature. And if you fight against middle back musculature, you can create prolonged discomfort. And so I recommend that if you're in this shape and it feels as if the musculature is fighting against you, you concede the win to the back musculature and go back to neutral. But assuming that you feel good here, we're just going to relax our way into this space. Again, bottoms of the feet can come together, knees can be bent, or legs can be extended. All of the leg positions will also change the length requirement in the back musculature. Bottoms of the feet together, knees out wide, actually offers the most space for the back. Legs extended offers the least space and intensifies the musculature pull the most. So make the choice that's right for you. So the winter in the Northeast had been particularly brutal. And so these two forest herbalists had spent a lot of time snowed in their cabins. And they had spent a lot of time without any food. And their bodies had gotten frail. And the first little break of winter is just upon them. And they go out into the forest and they're looking for wounded animals, as they are accustomed to. Their movement is slow and they're lethargic, and they're in this weakened state. More of a weakened state than would be typical for a winter, coming out of a winter. And they separate off so that they can cover more ground. And not very long after they separate, the apprentice comes across a squirrel that had fallen victim to a hunter's trap. And it has its arm, upper leg, let's say, trapped in the trap up to the shoulder. We'll give ourselves 30 more seconds here in this shape. And when you feel right, let's bring our knees back to neutral, if they're not there. And we'll press into the toe mounds and heels, lift the built line high enough to slide our prop out from underneath us. We can set that to the side. We won't necessarily need that, but you may want to have that. Let the tailbone come back down to the mat. And let's just start a little dynamic sway with our hips. Just nice and easy movement here, bringing some fluidity into the physicality. And at the same time, starting to, or maybe focusing on linking the movement and the breath. So these two haven't separated much. So the frontiersman looks over and he sees his apprentice with this squirrel. And he sees that it's, an injury at the shoulder. Not ideal for a squirrel, but the squirrel is certainly going to survive. Now that brings like a little warmth to his heart. And he picks up his pace a little bit as he ventures out into the woods. And it's about an hour later, the two kind of meet up at their union point, and the apprentice offers a squirrel skewer to this frontiersman. And the two sit down and they consume this, each of them with their half of the squirrel, missing one arm. Next time the knees fall over to the right, let's allow them to settle there. And so when they're done, the frontiersman says, I'm grateful for the meal, but I have to ask, why didn't you save that squirrel? It was obviously not a mortal injury. And they saved the tail for the raven, who's had just as hard of a winter as they had. And the apprentice goes on to say, I had to make the choice. I didn't feel like I had enough substance within me. And so I did take this squirrel's life. And the frontiersman gets very upset about this. And he goes on to lecture this apprentice about how that's not their role here, how that's not what they have, that's not the life they've chosen. And if he wants to be a part of this forest herbalist plan, he's going to need to change his strategy. When you're right, when you're ready, let's bring our knees back to neutral. And then eventually we'll let them fall over to the second side, the left side. And so because the two of them are entangled in this argument, they lose track of a little bit of time. And the sun is starting to set rapidly, as it does in the north. in late winter, early spring. And so they start heading back to camp. Both of them with a little more pace to their steps, thanks to the nourishment they receive from the squirrel. And they get back, and the sun is essentially gone. They come across this trap with a rabbit in it, and it just has its foot caught. When you're, we have 30 more seconds here on the second side. And the frontiersman's able to spring the trap, but the rabbit burst into this little ramble area full of thorns. And they're very close to their cabins here. When you're ready, we're going to bring our knees back. To neutral. Inhale and pull both thighs in towards the rib cage. And let your hands clasp either the hamstrings or the shins, whatever feels most comfortable. And then instead of thinking or worrying about the compression you create, can you create the shape of anterior hip compression and relax as much musculature as possible? And no matter where your hands are, the fingers are either on the posterior tibialis, so the inside of the shin musculature, or the inside of the hamstring musculature. And as the arms relax, as the shoulders relax, there's this subtle pull into width across the hip girdle. So the sacrum receives this passive desire for expansion, or this passive need for expansion, as we relax, and the arm musculature relaxes as much as the rest of the body. And we're just going to settle into that for another 30 seconds. Thinking about continuously relaxing any barriers of rigidity that you feel in the musculature. The body wants to hold stability, and you're just thinking about relaxing and not worrying about maintaining the shape, just allowing the body to soften. And then eventually we will bring our knees back together. Let's extend the legs down the mat and extend the arms overhead. I'm going to recommend palms up, but if palms down feels more appropriate for you, feel free. And then really think about reaching those fingers. So hand position, whatever feels most comfortable. I recommend palms up, but anything that feels appropriate. Really stretch the fingers and the toes in opposite directions for this last little bit of expansiveness. And then relax. Settle into the release of that relaxation. And let your consciousness just start to scan your body, asking if there are any needs. And then eventually asking yourself if there are any movements that would be beneficial for you before we find our way into Shavasana. And if there is anything that would be advantageous, let's offer that. And then eventually, let's just find and settle into that stillness of Shavasana. And so these two men have a brief discussion about this rabbit hiding in this bramble, and they determine that they're so close to their cabin. The nightfall is happening so quickly. It would be best if they just went back home for the night, and with the rise of the sun in the morning, got up and tended to this rabbit. And so they head home, they toss the squirrel tail to the raven, they make their individual fires, and they go to bed. And we're just settling into the as much stillness as possible for us. And so the next morning, these two men wake up and they go outside and they see the raven picking at the carcass of a rabbit, missing a foot. And the frontiersman kind of calls the raven over, sits on his shoulder, and takes it back over the cabin. The two men get together, and the apprentice is like, "What the heck is that?" And the frontiersman is like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Why? Yesterday I ate a squirrel. You scolded me. Today, the raven did the same thing to an injured rabbit. And yet you gently take it back home." We'll start to bring some movement to our fingers and our toes, to our wrists and our ankles. And so the frontiersman sits this apprentice down, movement up into your elbows and your knees, your shoulders and your hips, your neck and your head. Eventually, the entirety of the body moves. And we'll utilize that movement to transition from the shapes we are in back into a seat. And from this seated space, spine gets tall, breath gets fluid, eyes close. And the frontiersman says, the raven doesn't have the capacity to escape the gravitational pull of his nature. The algorithm that has coded the raven determines what it does. You, on the other hand, have the consciousness of a human, and thus choice. And we'll inhale our hands together, heart center. Over the course of the next 7 days, can you ensure that you are flexing your consciousness of humanity at every opportunity, and see how that impacts your experience? Thank you so much for being a part of this morning's practice and for being you. Namaste. Happy Sunday, guys. Love the heck out of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'll be back tomorrow night for a little bit of movement. Next weekend, I am moving, assuming everything goes as planned and I can get internet, I will have class. So I'll let you know if internet is a problem, but assuming that I have internet, we'll do this again next Sunday. I love the heck out of you, and I will see you very soon. Have a beautiful week. Mwah.